I have been now at the D.school at Stanford for a year, teaching various classes there. And towards the end of the fellowship, of the year's fellowship, the last 3 months has been, we've been allowed to basically deep dive into our own particular area of interest, whatever that may be. And so I chose to look at empathy and its link with mental health, because I was very interested in coming to the D.school, as you've spoken about yourself, that, you know, the D.school and many other people run courses in design thinking that can span anything from, yes, an hour to, as I've said, I've taught a 10-week course specifically on design thinking. And the Stanford sort of D.school process has 5 steps, and it begins with empathy as the first step. And that's all about going out into the world and finding out what people actually need in terms of, you know, what are their problems and what are the things that we're trying to reframe and redesign around. And so finding that, yes, you can sort of teach that process in an hour and that empathy is 10 minutes of that, it was a bit of a struggle for me, seeing kind of empathy done in a very light way. And I think it's, you know, it's always a bit of a conflict. Of course, we do need to be able to introduce it in a light way, in a quick way, and people understand the concept. But I was very interested in basically diving a little bit deeper into that and looking at all the different sides of empathy as well, rather than it just being a singular thing. And so from my own experience, I found that being sort of, I personally say I'm very highly empathic, and I have been looking at the link between that and essentially mental health and sort of mental burnout, and exploring that, using my time here at Stanford, linking up with the psychology department, the Centre for Compassion here, and the neuroscience department, because there's some fantastic work that they're all doing, just to dig a bit deeper and find a little bit about the science behind what's actually going on when you're being empathic. And
okay, well, let me see if I'm hearing so far. So you're a fellow at the D.school. And that, you know, usually in the D.school or in design, empathy is just a little part of the process, but you really wanted to dig into it. So you did like a 3-month like deeper dive into it. You've been looking at the different aspects of empathy, as well as looking at the mental health component of it. Like, how does it fit into the mental health? And yeah, so that's kind of what I was getting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way that research always starts for me is just by talking to people. I mean, there's kind of a split between user research and desktop research. So there's various books and reports and things that I have read and that I can go on reading. But ultimately, I initially started by basically taking a cross section of different careers out there and different professions, and talking to people about empathy, what they thought empathy was, how they used it in their professions. And this was, yeah, a mixture of people from psychologists and therapists, and sort of things that you can see empathy maybe being used a bit more obviously, through to sort of people using empathy in very difficult situations. For example, I spoke to a nurse on a palliative care ward, a cancer ward, where they were dealing with, you know, end of life, and how she deals with and manages with, of course, having to be there for people, but not sort of essentially taking that stress home with her and it affecting her personally. And that's all come from sort of my own personal experience when I've been doing user research. And I've just been exploring that link about basically, is it possible to have too much empathy? And this whole idea of basically blurring boundaries, blurring yourself with the other person that you're kind of employing empathy with or empathizing with, and how actually it can be quite harmful or quite dangerous.
Yeah, so you're looking at empathy, and also it sounds like you're looking at what are maybe perhaps the negatives, what you would see as maybe negative sides of empathy, And one is, can you like empathize too much, as well as the sort of this merging that can happen where you kind of lose your sense of self and others, and maybe a painful place there. It sounds like you've also had like also dealing from like personal experiences of that you've had around this.
Let me like ultimately say I'm not against empathy. I'm very much, an empathic being, and believe that empathy is the way forward. I just have felt through my own personal experience and doing this research and talking to people that I believe it's also very useful and actually critical that we also talk about some of the negative sides of empathy that it can bring. Now, as you mentioned there with the sort of the self-other overlap, what I found is basically that it does hugely come down to a sense of about being self-aware, basically, and building your own sort of self-awareness. And I think that was something that when I've sort of previously learned about empathy and find out about myself being empathic, I didn't really realize. I've always thought about, and also taught it to others, that it's always about the other, and about you, and forget about yourself, and don't sort of ever think, for example, if you're interviewing someone, don't ever sort of say, oh yeah, this one time that and bring it back to yourself. And so it's very much a sort of selfless act. And yet, in sort of doing this research and really unpicking a little bit more my personal experience, I guess I've realized the importance for actually it also being about you. In that you also need to have a very strong sense of self-awareness and sense of self in order to retain actually those boundaries and not create that blurring. And I think it's a difficult thing. I'm still exploring, what does that actually mean and how do you do that? And of course, a lot of it comes down to sort of mindfulness and practicing more sort of Buddhist techniques. Another sort of,
let me reflect that what I'm hearing there. So it's like you're seeing that there's this blurring that happens, this possible merging, and when we're doing your research, you're seeing it. You were kind of teaching that it's all about the other person, right? It's like you have to just listen to them, and you're sort of like almost like self-sacrificing or something of yourself, and you were seeing that there's really in this empathy part, there's something about having a sense of self-awareness as well. And it sounds like you're looking for techniques and different ways of actually developing that sense of self and that more fuller empathic presence. I will add that, doing the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, that we're proposing that we need to build a more empathic culture. So we're really trying to promote the value of empathy. And when I hear sort of people looking like you were kind of laying out what you were seeing as the dark side, not the dark side, but the other side of empathy, I like to engage and empathize and hear what it is that your thoughts and experiences are, because I'm trying to see how do we really promote empathy in the culture more widely. Absolutely. And so you're identifying one aspect that can happen within empathy, that one starts to sacrifice oneself and see that as empathy, and that can have like negative consequences. And how do you kind of maintain a sense of self and other is kind of the quest, it sounds like, that you're on.
And it's I am very much appreciative of I'm very much a believer in your work, and appreciative that you're reaching out to find out sort of these other experiences, because ultimately I also believe that we need to be building this culture of empathy. I guess it's just also sort of within that going a little bit deeper and occasion and when needed to expose and uncover these other sides of it. It's important to say that when I'm looking at this work and this sort of other side, it's specifically when you're using empathy in sort of, let's say, difficult situations. because of course there's positive empathy, and there's just everyday life empathy. When I'm looking at it specifically within design, it's often because as designers we're looking to improve someone's life in some way, and it may be it may be, for example, one project that I had that I mentioned in the article is me doing some work with basically seniors and older people that have lower limb loss, and so they can't get up the stairs, and it was working with a stair lift company, and what my particular personal experience there was having that sort of blurring and almost that catastrophizing of, oh my gosh, you know, is this going to happen to all of us? And it becoming sort of an overwhelming fear, actually, that, you know, that things were negative and the things would be bad. And what that does when you're a designer and you need to basically be in this sort of slightly more positive mindset where you're reframing things and you're thinking of ideas, if you end up going down into that spiral of despair, it doesn't put you in a good place to innovate, essentially. And so that is what I'm trying to do, is just basically prompt designers to understand and consider all of the different aspects of empathy when specifically dealing in difficult situations. That might be, you know, third world countries, that might be in healthcare examples.
So what I'm hearing there is that, like, working with elderly that had lower extremities difficulty, like with walking or so forth, and that it sounds like you're taking on sort of the stress that they're feeling and the difficulty and the difficult feelings, perhaps a lot of painful feelings, and you're sort of taking that on, and it's taking you into sort of a darker, negative, downward emotional spiral of sorts. So that by empathizing, seeing where they are, it was having this effect on you.
It's basically like feeling someone else's pain. And that's where this sense of self is so important, and basically being able to separate yourself from the other and understand what is their sense of pain and what's going on yourself in your own body and your own mind, and just understanding that you can be there for them, you can listen to them, you can understand, but you don't necessarily have to fully feel and immerse yourself to the point where you go down into a spiral. And let me just, it very much links to a sort of another element that I start to hint at in my article, which is basically, and it's the bit that I'm currently sort of discovering more about, I'll be bringing out another piece in a couple of weeks, is how do you actually, once you're in that moment where you're feeling sort of empathic distress, which is a very natural human, you know, everyone feels it to different levels, how do you actually move away from going down the downward spiral and move into something that's more of a sort of positive action, or reframing into a sort of positive mindset?
So what I'm hearing there is this is where you are, is you're wondering, okay, if you're empathizing with people and you're starting to feel negative feelings, and perhaps you can see you're beginning to go into kind of a depression or negative sort of a downward spiral, how do you keep from going in that direction? And you were calling that empathic distress. I would also like to say it's also called personal distress too.
Yes.
In the sense, in some form, I would say that's not even empathy, that's just, you know, by empathizing, you're just becoming distressed. And maybe I could just add a comment here about how I would see this, is a lot of the empathy is seen from an individualistic point of view. You as an individual, them as an individual. And when I talk about a culture of empathy, it's sort of seeing the system, right? So it's you and the other person are in a system. And when you're starting to feel depressed or, you know, feeling that stress, for me, that's not an empathic distress, that's an empathy deficit. See, because you are going into a negative space, and the solution for that is more empathy for you from others, not necessarily just the people you're dealing with, but sort of your support, community that says, oh, I'm hearing you're really starting to go into distress, and a space for you to start sharing and connecting, and also having kind of several people or even a group that you can share this with kind of triangulates you emotionally. So you start creating a sense of self, of your own self, and you start being heard, and that becomes the healing of your own personal empathy deficit, I would say. There's a shortage of you having empathy. So that's kind of how I look at, looking at it from a system group point of view versus the individualistic point of view, which much of psychology looks at from that angle. So anyway, that's how I would kind of just respond.
No, that's
so. And if you would be willing to just reflect back your understanding of what I said, if you.
Yeah. Well, it sounded like what you're saying is when you're using empathy, and you can kind of go into what I was calling empathic distress. You were sort of reframing that as possibly actually being an empathy deficit.
Yeah.
So, and it is very much a sort of individual place where you start to sort of, get swallowed in your own emotions, and basically it becomes an inward looking thing rather than an outward looking thing. And so when you're talking about a culture of empathy, you're actually talking about support of others. And so seeing, rather than it being an inward individual thing, looking at it being part of a system.
Yeah.
And so this culture of empathy, or even, as you say, a circle of empathy, using other people as that support to then, I think you say, triangulate, and it helps to bring a sense of self.
You're right. Exactly. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm making notes.
We're recording this, so we're making notes with the recording as well. And I think you were headed in that direction too, because I saw you talk about reciprocity too in your article.
Exactly.
And you're saying with empathy there must be reciprocity, or it leads to burnout. So it seems like you're already kind of heading in that direction.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a sort of interesting thing. Questions that have come back to me on that is, does it have to be a direct reciprocity, as in from if it's just you and me empathizing with each other, does it have to be direct from you? Or I think what you're possibly pointing towards is not necessarily, it can be part of a system.
Right.
And I think that's a really good point to bring up.
And even the people that you're talking to who might be in having their own, the people with those disabilities, they might be in great distress themselves, pain and distress themselves. So they're actually needing a wider group of their own for support. So you might be listening to them, and they might not even have the capacity to listen back to you, because they're almost like needing emergency empathy themselves. But they need a culture of support, of empathic support around them, just as well as you as the listener need a culture of empathy and a support system behind you to keep your own grounding and equilibrium.
Fantastic. I'm drawing a diagram for that. What's really interesting, but I've gone to a little bit into the science of it within Stanford. They have a neuroscience department within the psychology area, with a sort of imaging brain scanning machine, and they've been doing experiments where they essentially expose people to other people's pain through sort of imagery or sounds, and see what's happening in the brain at that point. And the really interesting thing that I found there actually is, or that they found, of course, and that I've discovered is basically what's going on in the neurons in your brain when you're experiencing someone else's pain. It's activating the same neurons as if you were experiencing your own pain. And so that's that kind of quite abstract thing of saying, oh yeah, I'm feeling someone else's pain, that I've been speaking about for a while, I've actually realized is very much a thing that's actually going on inside your head. Yeah,
so you're mentioning mirror neurons, that when we see an action or do the same action, the same neurons are firing in our brain. So even as we're looking at each other and I just see you shaking your head, I see a smile, that my neurons are also slightly firing as you're doing that, and I can feel like your face lit up for a second. I could feel the emotion of that feeling of within you, and or maybe more your concentration. So you can see my hands waving, and you can kind of feel the energy of that. So there is this constant mirroring and feeling of each other that happens. So what I'm hearing you say there is that there's the center. I think that's with Jamil Jackie and his center, where he's studying there at Stanford empathy, and that he's been doing fMRI studies around this, around pain.
Exactly. And the interesting shift then in this work seems to be that center linked with the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research, also at Stanford. So if in a very blunt way, they see the answer to sort of empathic distress or this negative side of empathy, they see the answer as being compassion. They see compassion basically going beyond empathy. And that's what I'm looking at now, is at that point where you may be experiencing empathic distress, how do you engage in a compassionate response? Because that's been proven in the sort of neuroscience end of things to actually create feelings of, well, positive feelings, but also pro-social behavior and motivation to help.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying from the Center for Compassion, Autism Research and Education, CCARE, that they're advocating for compassionate responses to that sense of overwhelm or stress, that there's a response that they have of what they would call compassion, of how to deal with that distress.
And you know, they actually do a lot of compassion training. The specific one that they teach is called loving kindness training, which is essentially sort of a series of experiencing or promoting compassion within yourself, through to your friends and family, through to strangers, and then through to sort of the rest of humanity. And it's a sort of, it's definitely based in mindful meditation techniques, and I'm just exploring that a little bit. And I just wonder whether my ultimate, for a few weeks I was going down the route of, okay, well, compassion is the answer, but actually my question now really is, can you get to a compassionate response without empathy? And I'm not sure that you can. I think that it seems that empathy is a prerequisite to compassion.
Yeah, that's you know, what we're talking about here is empathy and compassion. And I mean, if you look at the literature, the definitions kind of go all over the place with this stuff. So it's really hard to know what we're even talking about. Like, you know, there's all these nuances, and when you get into the nuances, it gets very difficult. And there's very different definitions of compassion as well. So for me, empathy is like a spectrum of feeling into all feelings, basically. Like any experience you have, you know, I can feel you writing something, kind of having a sense of focus and concentration on that. And so that's, you know, I don't see any pain there, right? That's just kind of what you're doing. So for me, compassion is a slice of the empathy pie or spectrum.
Right.
It's specifically empathy. What do you do when you're empathizing with someone that's in pain, and what is kind of like the response? Now, there's other people, I think, who have a different view of compassion, which might be more sympathy, where, oh, I see pain, and I sort of withdraw from it, and then I think about, you know, kind of like positive, you know, maybe sort of a sympathetic, I care about you, sort of more response. But in some cases, that can actually be a block to empathy, because you're no longer connected to the person. You're off in your own kind of head trying to have positive thoughts and sympathy. So it depends on how we're using the terms, but there is the phenomenon itself that we can kind of talk about. So
Yeah.
That's kind of how I kind of deal with it and wrestle it. And I know you referred to a Tanya Singer and Olga Klimek study, and I think that study has a lot of problems in terms of how he's using definitions. And
absolutely,
I've talked with other academics and like at Harvard and the Helen Reese, who's has a center there for empathy and relationship studies, and also is a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General. So she was writing a response to that study, just saying they're kind of like if the study is kind of like you're seeing somebody else's. And I've actually interviewed Olga about this. And I can't remember the study exactly, but it was the whole definition stuff just didn't really make sense to me. And there's a real contention between us, about what we're calling empathy. It's like you see somebody's pain, think about their pain, let's call that empathy, and doesn't that feel horrible? And then now feel somebody's pain. Now think of the love for your mother and feel that love, and then which feels better? That's kind of what it is. And it has serious problems, that study. And it's the main study that the compassion community is kind of referring back to. That one study out of hundreds of studies, that's the one that they'll always reference. And
interestingly, what that study comes down to, at least in the kind of the summary paper that I looked at, is this one sort of diagram with empathy on one side and compassion on the other side, and what it leads to, and very much these distinct, separate things, which I've looked at, and yes, that has fundamental problems for me as well. That you can be like empathy versus compassion, and it starts to infer that empathy is bad and compassion is good.
Yeah, and part of it is it seemed to me as kind of a strategy for transferring this negative approach to compassion, calling this compassion fatigue is a very common term. And so it's almost like they're saying, no, there's no compassion fatigue, it's really empathy fatigue. So they're kind of like trying to dump it into the empathy bucket to kind of promote this other. So there's all these different kind of problems within it, and it's good to dialogue about it, and let's talk about it, let's hear each other, and that's why I try to empathize and try to hear. And
I love what you said back there, that compassion is a slice of the empathy spectrum, or let's say the empathy pie, or whatever it is. That's what I'm coming to. I was looking at these sort of comparison studies and things, and actually I do believe that empathy is the umbrella thing going on here, and that compassion comes as a slice or an element that can be employed and engaged slightly later, and as a useful positive emotional sort of aspect to bring into things, but it isn't the either or.
Yeah. So you're getting kind of that sense too, that it's kind of more of a slice too. So there's sort of and it sounds like you've been seeing some of the difficulties in those studies as well, kind of on your journey to understand this topic.
There's such conflicting information out there with these studies, and it's really, each one I read, I'm very inspired by, and it's really like, oh, it works like that. That's really interesting. And I sort of go off on a little bit of a thought track. And then I find another one. I'm like, oh no, well, this is saying that. Hang on, how does that, and so these sort of things are swimming in my mind at the moment, but I'm coming to a kind of area of clarity, I hope. What I'm actually working on now is a diagram that talks about this, that talks about basically starting with empathy, when compassion might come in, what you might do if you are feeling some negative feelings around using empathy, how you can reframe that, and basically a sort of simple tool that designers can use when they're working in difficult situations.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you want to develop some support tools for people that when they go into these difficult environments, I mean, like people like you were talking about, even the developing world or other places, like what do you do when you start going into these negative places? And here's a set of tools that
Yeah.
you can use.
Exactly, and I think some of it might be a bit more preparatory. So it's you know, where are you at before you even go into that situation, and doing a little bit of sort of self-diagnostic work, and understanding your own sort of levels of empathy and where you're at, and then also during. So if there's, you know, basically reflection tools that you can kind of come back to. They might be sort of problem cards or sort of question cards that you can ask yourself, to just keep checking in with yourself, where you're at, and essentially help you move through what can be some sort of difficult aspects of empathy, and move them into the positive realm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, you're just trying to see what are the approaches that you can take, and one of them, I wasn't quite clear on what the approach is, kind of more of a self-analysis or self-awareness. I guess that was to be more self-aware of what's happening inside yourself.
Absolutely, I think, yeah, I think it would start with probably reflection tools, but it would start with that self-awareness and knowing where you are at, perhaps on a particular spectrum, if that's even possible. That's sort of what I'm exploring. But also, once you're actually in a situation, it might well be more sort of diagnostic, as in like, are you feeling this? Yes, okay, think about this and move towards this, or, you know, honestly, I'm not totally sure yet. I'll be able to share it with you as it sort of develops.
Well, there is the notion of self-empathy. So it's like the self-empathy, for me, the way I define empathy, it's the feeling into, like the origination of the word, you know, I'm feeling, to feel into. So as we empathize, we just do it naturally to feel into the experience of others, but we also feel into our own experience, right?
Yeah.
So it's the self-empathy. So and there's techniques for identifying the felt experience in the self. So if I feel stress or I feel fear, I can sense into that sense of fear and then see what is the underlying need that I have behind the fear, meaning what is the feeling that I want underneath the fear. So I can say, oh, I'm feeling I'm feeling stressed about all this political stuff that's going on here and with these demonstrations. I'm feeling anxiety about it, and I'm really needing more support. You know, I'm needing more support from others to help address this. So that's like a need that I have, or a feeling that I want, a feeling of being supported and cared about.
Yeah.
And you can take if you're going into depression, you know, you can say, well, I'm feeling this depression, this feeling of depression. And what is the need that I have? I have a need for support, or I have a need for hope, or I have a need for connection or something. So there's a process called nonviolent communication. I don't know if you've heard about that, by Marshall Rosenberg. So he was a student of Carl Rogers, who, I don't know if you've heard of Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers really did a lot of work with empathic listening in psychology. Marshall Rosenberg was one of his students who kind of made this point, creating a process for feeling into other people's experiences and into your own, and seeing what are the needs behind, or the feelings behind what people are wanting. So that's like a whole thread. And there's another process called focusing, which is by Gene Genlin, who was also a grad student of Carl Rogers. And his insight is that in therapy, when you're listening to others, like the therapist would listen to others, and it was like some people are having more success in therapy than others. So why were they having more success? And his insight is the people who talked about their felt experience in therapy were actually the ones that had the most growth from therapy. So instead of being like detached, you know, whatever, saying, well, and in the moment feel like, oh, I'm feeling a little stressed right now, even identifying like the stress is in my head, like around here. I'm feeling a little heaviness here. I'm feeling a bit of enthusiasm here about the conversation. So you start identifying the felt experiences within your body, and then you have someone who's a listener for you and reflects back your understanding, their understanding of your felt experience. And so there's a whole field around this that is also like another tool or gateway that's kind of quite well developed, but not well known.
Yes, absolutely. That's the thing. I with all of this work, I don't necessarily think I'm inventing anything new, but what's wonderful is just to actually bring this up as dialogue and conversation into the design world, because when I started doing this work, it was an area that just wasn't being talked about. And so ultimately, even pointing towards some of these tools and bringing an awareness of them out there into sort of, into conversation within designers is ultimately what I want to be doing.
Yeah, as you can kind of merge some of those other tools with kind of the support designers and
exactly.
And yeah, and design is great. One of the tools for the empathy movement, I see design as sort of like the kind of I guess backbone of it, yes. Right? It's like if we create a lot more tools for the empathy part and the support, and then you've got all those other tools of design for building a culture of empathy, and so that's why I was looking forward to talking to you about your work. And are you planning on continuing this? I mean, is this like digging deeper into this, or?
Yeah, I definitely. It's sort of something that I'm so personally attached to. So it's not something that I'm sort of doing just for work. I was really lucky actually that they sort of gave me the opportunity to just dive into whatever it was that I wanted to. I'm heading back to England. I'll be working there with the Design Thinkers Academy. And so they are essentially creating courses and tools for people that want to learn about design thinking. That's both sort of open courses as well as bespoke ones for clients. And so at the moment they have, a sort of 3 or 4 courses that they offer in design thinking and creative leadership, but I'll be going there to actually develop some new courses, teach what they already do, and also develop new curriculum. And I'll be looking to continue this work and actually create, once it's basically bring it together into more of a learning experience that can be delivered to people. And so that will be what I'm working on over the next year. I'd love to keep in touch with you. And
yeah, that'd be great. And see if there was any overlap, because the approach, I've been working on the empathy for about 10 years now, and all those books back here are, the whole 2 rows are books on empathy, right? And I've interviewed most of the authors of those books as well. And the easiest step I found for building the empathy is that active listening. Is the first step that Carl Rogers did and just promoted throughout the whole therapeutic world. It's the easiest and fastest way to get started. Yeah. And now, Alan Alda has a new book out. I don't know if you've seen that one. It's on empathy. Oh, yeah. Let's see. So I think you'd really find this one interesting. It just came out.
I have this look on my face.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's all about communication, but it's basically about empathy. It's chapter after chapter. He basically says communication is empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy is communication. So it's really, this book is about empathy. And he's coming, and he mentions the active listening, and he's also approaching it from which design does too, from the improv, the yes and the sensitivity of listening to people's, felt experience and responding to them. So it's one of the best books, from a practical kind of level.
I'll have a look at that. And I wonder if you've, I can't remember the name, it's Paul someone, and he came out with that one called Against Empathy a year or 2 ago. Have you spoken to him?
My approach when people kind of, criticize, attack empathy, I says, Let me empathize with you. Let me hear what your criticism is. I want to empathize with you. 4 years ago, he came out with his first article in the New Yorker against empathy. I immediately said, Paul, talk to me. Let me interview you and empathize with your point of view. He said, I'm too busy.
Oh, really?
And then I said, well, when will you be busy? When will you have time? And he didn't respond. It was basically, I'm going to be busy for the rest of my life.
Okay.
So I have tried for 4 years to have him talk on camera about and empathize with his point of view and have it, I call it an empathy circle, which is it's like the active listening, but a mutual active listening. We both actively, and this is the process that I've found is the easiest starting point for kind of mutual dialogue. I was doing a bit with you, that we do it with each other, and it goes into conflict resolution, personal well-being, that sense of self-connection as a tool. He will not talk with me. We've done email, conversations, that much. But his whole thing, his whole criticism is that if you go to a therapist and you're like in a wild rage, then empathy for him is the therapist would go into empathize with you and they would go into a wild rage.
Right.
That's the core of his argument. And for me, that is the sympathetic response.
Yeah.
And in fact, what he is criticizing is something that is a block to empathy.
Yeah.
If you go into that sympathetic response, you are actually blocking empathy. The therapist could not, no therapist. And then it's a very deceptive book because he said he then defines his terms. He references, first off, Adam Smith. Adam Smith never talked about empathy. He talked about sympathy. And then Paul says, oh, but he really meant empathy. Then he references the other philosopher, David Hume, who's a contemporary. And David Hume says this. David Hume used the word sympathy. He never used the word empathy. Then he references Darwin. And Darwin never talked about empathy. He talked about sympathy. And then he talks about Freud, and Freud was used the word empathy and sympathy, but the part he references is him talking about sympathy. So I actually agree with a lot of his criticism that what the phenomenon he's criticizing has negative effects, and the negative effects is that it blocks empathy. But he won't talk on. He would not talk with me. He would not talk with Helen Reese from Harvard. He will not talk with anybody that is knowledgeable on the topic. So that's my kind of critique. But I'm still open to talk to him.
That talks a lot about potentially. I did see, I don't know if it was the New York Times, but there was a conversation between him and Jamil. Did you see that?
It was an email. It was a text
response.
Yeah, and I think that's really hard. What I want is an empathy circle where they actually listen to each other, where they reflect back their understanding of what the other person has said to the satisfaction of the speaker.
Exactly.
That they say, you have fully understood what I am saying, and then it's your turn now to speak. And that's the kind of dialogue, what I would call an empathy circle. That is a dialogue I want to have and also see him have.
I agree, because in reading that text sort of article, that was exactly what wasn't happening. They were responding and not understanding each other. It was quite uncomfortable reading it.
Yes.
Okay, that's really...
So anyway, that's the process in terms of the empathy circle process, I think is the kind of a tool, a starting tool that we're trying to develop more. And in fact, these mediations I'm trying to set up with these rallies and counter rallies is to bring the organizers together online into an empathy circle, and we facilitate a dialogue so that they really hear each other. And if we had the design community kind of helping design tools for fostering that, it would be a huge help as a first step.
That's wonderful. Maybe I can put you in touch with a few people at the D.school who will be there obviously beyond when I leave, I can actually make that connection for you.
Sure.
A few people, I'll think about who, I'll put some careful thought into who would be the right person for you to connect with, but there may well be some a wonderful collaboration that could happen there, I think. Is there anything that I can keep engaged with, or anything going on over the pond in England that you're doing, or will it just be keeping in touch sort of online? And
Yeah, it's online. The Center for Building cultureofempathy.com is the website. There's a Facebook page as well. And if you're wanting to like develop a curriculum, maybe incorporate some of this, because I think those would be some tools.
Absolutely.
Because that said of having these empathy circles with designers where they really hear each other and create a space to share what's happening for them emotionally, and bring in some of these tools from like focusing. I can send you links to that community. Those are great tools for self-care and identity building and working through sort of these emotional these painful feelings or stuck places.
Yeah. I think I'd love to create a curriculum and a course that really just concentrates on all of this, and really spend some deep time going into these techniques. I think it will be eye-opening for people, especially in this day and age. So maybe we can keep in touch, and it's something I can plan with you and talk to you about as I go forth back in England. Let me join up to your Facebook and things so I can follow what you're doing as well. And then I will have a think about who to connect you up with to keep this.
Okay, great. We keep in contact, and glad to collaborate on anything, because online. There's also have a educator's account with Mural. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Yes, I use Mural. It might be worth you having a little look at something called practical service design. This is who Megan there, who's the co-founder, is who I taught my other class with, my civic engagement class. She works at Stanford as a service designer, but has created this quite large global community on Slack. And it may well be worth you connecting up with her, or I connect you, because they have a fantastic community here at in the Bay Area and sort of elsewhere. But she was the one that introduced me to Mural, and we worked together remotely on that.
Love to connect.
Great.
Okay, well, excellent. So glad to have talked to you. I really enjoyed the tone. It's like the personal exploration part of your article. It seemed very personal, kind of very real in terms of your own personal journey and quest.
It was. I struggled a little bit at the beginning of whether I wanted to, share that sort of that personal side, but I realized it was the only way.
Yeah.
To sort of for people to really understand, and for me to be able to really go into it and explore it, was rather than sort of shying away from what may have happened personally with me. It was more let's embrace it and lean into it. So.
It really came across. I thought it was very effective. So
I'm glad.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, have a great.
Okay, well, good, Holly. Then nice talking to you. Bye.
Bye.